Hey there guys, and welcome back. On this week's show, we're making a fluting jig. Now this jig is not a normal jig that I would do here on the show. It is not some elaborate sort of thing. In fact, this jig is temporary because I have a problem and I need a solution for it, and fluting is the way to go. So let's have a look over at the bench and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Well, I'm in the middle of a model build, and what I need to do is get 12 perfectly spaced routes, 1/16 of an inch wide, 1/16 of an inch deep, all the way along the back end of this section right here. Now, it's a difficult process to do it by hand. You would never get it to look right. So we need to make a small little, you know what? It's a very basic jig. It is nothing special. And it will use the indexing pins of my mini lathe. And that will allow me to get perfectly spaced routings. But what we need to do is the first thing is I need to choose which router I want to use, and as well, we need to build pretty much a carriage to hold that router. Well, the router that I want to use for this is my battery rigid trim router, and I have taken off its base plate because I don't think it's going to be necessary for this little jig. So what I've done is I've taken a piece of 1/2 inch plywood. It's 4 3/8 of an inch wide. I think it's just under 10 inches long, and I have sat my router the way that I want it on there. I have then used some spacer blocks or setup blocks to basically support the router up on its end until I get the bottom of the router square to my tabletop, and then I've paid attention to what the measurement is. In this case, it's 1 3/8 of an inch. That is from this edge, the top surface of the plywood. Now I have taken a piece of 3/4 inch plywood. I have measured the outer diameter of my router motor and making it so that the router will sit. The bottom of this hole here is at 1 3/8 of an inch above the top surface of our 1/2 inch. I have drawn the diameter of our circle. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this over to the scroll saw, and we're going to cut that circle out. So at this point you should have something that looks like this, and you can see that I have an extra notch at the top, and that is to allow for the adjustment bolt that's at the top of my router motor. Yours may or may not have that. What I want to do now is centered in this waist area and centered on the thickness, I want to take this piece over to the drill press, and we're going to drill a 1/4 inch diameter hole right through just past the center line that is on our circle or on our mounting plate. And now at this point, we want to take this over to the table saw, and we're going to cut it off right at that center line. And once you get that done, the holes that you have here, we can now make these through holes all the way down through our piece of plywood. Well, the next step that I've done is I've taken a 1/2 inch Forstner bit and I've drilled in the bottom a 1/2 inch diameter hole. It's probably about 1/2 an inch deep. And we've now taken some lengths of 1/4-20 rod. These are 5 inches long. And what I've done is I have crushed the threads at one end in the vise, and we'll take a nut and we're going to spin it on there so that the threads will jam onto the end of that, there we go, on the end of that rod. And I will now take the rods, we're going to push them up through our pieces of 3/4 inch plywood. I'm going to mix up some 2-part epoxy, and I am going to glue these in here so that they will be a permanent fixture inside this section. So we can now glue the front of our jig together. I've cut a couple of triangles, making sure that this section here is at 90 degrees, and that will be to support our main front board. So we will basically glue this together in this kind of a configuration, and once we get everything all the way we want it and glued and clamped up, we're just going to let it dry up, and that pretty much is our platform to hold our router. I may add more supports, I don't know. I have to wait until it dries to see how steady the router is. So let's get this glued up and then let it dry and we'll test. And once everything is dry, you can just sit your router in your little holder there in the front, slide your secondary piece over top, line it up however you wish, and then a couple of 1/4 inch flat washers and a couple of 1/4 jig knobs, and this is it. This is our router sled now completed. It's not super high tech, but it does the job. It will do what we need it to do. So we'll just tighten that down, and we can see this is very solid in here. That is not going to go anywhere, and we will be able to slide our router as we wish. So at this point in time now, we want to take this and head over to our lathe. Now, when doing fluting over here at the lathe, what we need, or the important thing to remember, is that your bit has to be right on with the center axis of your headstock. And for that, I've just basically clamped together this makeshift table. If this works well, I'll probably glue this up and that sort of thing and make it so it's a permanent fixture or something that's permanently being able to be used, as I'm sure it'll come in handy later on. But what this is, this lower table here is actually the work table from our lathe duplicator that I did on the show. And then I've just taken a couple boards and raised it up and made this other platform to get it so that our bit will ride equal with the center axis of our piece, or of our headstock. Now you may see this little piece of stock here on the end, and what this is a 3/4 inch thick piece of plywood that I've used a 1/2 inch hole saw, and I've cut it out. So this actually, the purpose for this is actually a depth stop. So where this sits over top of your bit, just like that, our bit protrudes out of this by 1/16 of an inch, and therefore it won't allow it to cut any deeper than that. So that is what that is. That is just our depth stop. So now it's time to do our fluting on our piece. This is the nerve-wracking part. So how do we do it? Well, you know what? Let me show you the process. Well, let's start off with the indexing, and you can see here that on our main spindle we have numbers. There's 1, 2, 3, all the way around to 24. That's 24 solid stop positions. So what you need to do is this here, this pin on our lathe, this will rotate 90 degrees and it will lock. See that? That just locked that spindle in there to whatever position. For me, I've placed a little marker here. That is position 2. So what I want to do for mine, I need 12 routings all the way around. There's 24 positions, so I need to set it at every second lock position. So I will set it here at the number 2, do my routing, release the pin, turn it to number 4, lock in number 4, do my routing, and again, turn it to number 6, lock it in, do my routing, the same thing, all the way around till I get all the routing done. So let's have a look at the routing process itself. So on our table right here, I have clamped a board, and that will be our fence to give us our starting position. Our bit is protruding 1/16 of an inch beyond our little makeshift primitive stop here, and I have the lathe locked in to spindle position 2. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on the router, I'm going to run it along this fence here and plunge it right into the side of my piece. Then I'm just going to freehand route all the way across until it exits out the back end of the piece. A little nerve-wracking for me here, as it took me quite a while to turn these pieces for this model, but let's give it a try and see what happens. Well, that plywood stop is actually burning my turning, which I'm not impressed with. I'm going to continue and see if maybe I can sand those burns off afterwards. So let me get a few of these done and see how I make out. Okay, well that didn't turn out too badly at all, but honestly, I think this plywood stop here, get rid of it. Maybe something more like a UHMW plastic or something to that effect, but for now I think I'd be better off to freehand it for the depth. Just careful light passes. It's not a large heavy bit, so that should be just fine. So let's set up and do another one and see how we make out with the freehand of it. Okay, and for my purposes here with this model, that worked out much better. I was able to sand the burns out of the other one, but why have to deal with that if you don't have to? So there you go. There's just a little bit of router fluting for you, making a quick little simple jig to hold your router. And there you have it. A fluting jig. Guys, this is really nothing special. This is no great feat of engineering. It is some simple scrap plywood that is cut in a certain way to hold your router steady on a horizontal plane so that you can route repeated lines and keep them horizontal to your piece using the indexing of your lathe headstock to do it. Honestly, guys, this is the most primitive jig I could possibly come up with, and most of it, as in the table that the jig itself rides on, is temporary. It's a temporary setup for this particular application. Whether or not I keep it is another story. I'm definitely going to keep the router cradle, and then if I have more fluting to do later on down the road, I can do that and be able to have the setup all ready to go. It took a crazy amount of time to actually think of this. This was actually the second or third, I believe it was, revision of this little jig, because as I made the original ones, they didn't work. None of them worked. All of the fittings and that sort of thing that held the router motor in place ended up getting in my way, and it was hitting the headstock in such a way that I couldn't do the routing that I needed to do. So there is plenty of room for modification on this, and feel free to take the initial concept, make it your own, and modify it to suit the needs that you have. Just because I did it in this one particular way doesn't mean that you need to do it that way, and I fully encourage all of you to take the ideas that I present here on the show and twist them and turn them and make them your own. As long as you're doing things safely, who cares? Make it yours. Make one. Guys, I want to thank you so much for tuning in this week. A little short one today. No big feats of engineering, as I said, and just basically demonstrating to you that where there's a will, there's a way, as long as you're willing to take the time to think it through and figure out the thought process of how to do it. Guys, this one here is a lot of fun. This may be something that will be useful to you, even if you're a wood turner. Making one of these little router sleds to hold your router motor is a great way to get fluting on your turning pieces. There's plenty of ways to get accents on turning, and who knows, maybe I'll do a show on that a little later in the season. Either way, guys, I want to thank you so much for tuning in. If you haven't already, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. Click that bell and then you won't miss the notifications of future episodes of the program. We have a ton of fun here every Tuesday and Friday, and I hope you're going to consider becoming a part of that audience. Guys, I hope that you've enjoyed today's content. I hope that it's given you some ideas of how you can do things in your shop. I hope you're going to try it for yourself. And more importantly, I hope you're going to join me again next week when I bring you yet another woodworking video.